No one ever told Elias Ward that a man could vanish while still being alive. Not in the literal sense, but piece by piece, like wood eaten from the inside out. It wasn't the war that broke him. Not exactly. It was what came after. The silence. The stares. The way people avoided his eyes like they might catch something if they looked too long. He'd returned to Dry Hollow with one good arm, half a pension, and a past no one asked about. And somehow, that was harder to survive than the battlefield. He lived on the edge of town, in a cabin he built himself with one hand and a mouth full of curses. Most days passed in quiet routine, mending fences, patching boots, counting coins to see if he'd stretch until next week. He didn't complain. There was no one to hear it if he did. But late at night, when the lamp burned low and the wind slipped through the cracks in the window, he caught himself wondering if this was it, if life was just a slow unraveling, one lonely day at a time, until the letter arrived. Marcus never imagined that in his 30s, his life would shrink to the size of a small cabin on the edge of Santa Olivia, a dusty town that had no patience for weakness, no matter how it came to be. Since the accident in the mine, he had become a shadow of the man he once was. His left leg, now, twisted and shortened, forced him to use crutches and to measure every step. But what hurt more than the physical pain was how people looked at him, or didn't. Pity, avoidance, discomfort. That was the new language of his interactions. The town hadn't turned its back on him with cruelty, but rather with unease, which in some ways felt even worse. Where once there had been laughter and work and camaraderie, now there was only space, empty space. Still, Marcus clung to a strange kind of hope. He responded to marriage ads in the newspaper, each time pouring honesty and humility into letters he wasn't even sure anyone would read. 3 replies had come, all rejections. Yet with every letter sent, a small part of him dared to believe again. Maybe the next one would be different. Maybe someone out there still believed in second chances. The last letter he wrote had been to a widow named Clara Diaz from a village in Goiás. Her advertisement had struck him deeply, seeking a kind and hard-working man to share life with dignity and respect. She didn't ask for strength or appearance, only kindness. That alone gave Marcus the courage to try once more. In his letter, he didn't beg for sympathy. He wrote about the accident, yes, but as a turning point, not a tragedy. He told her about his small vegetable garden, his modest cabin, and his bookkeeping work at the town store. He described the peace he had found in simplicity and his desire to build a life based on partnership, not survival. As always, he sealed the letter with a trembling hand and left it with the shopkeeper to send off with the week's mail. Then came the waiting. Long, silent, painful waiting. The lack of response was worse than a no. It felt like he didn't even deserve the courtesy of rejection. Still, he kept imagining a future where someone, somewhere, would see value in him beyond the crutches and the limp. Maybe that future didn't exist, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to stop reaching for it. In Santa Olivia, everyone knew Marcus, but few really saw him anymore. He had become background, noise, familiar but easy to ignore. People didn't exclude him with harshness but with indifference. Conversations ended as he approached. Mothers gently guided their children away. He wasn't feared. He was simply avoided. That hurt more than insults ever could. And Marcus, as proud as he was, pretended not to notice, but he did. Every single time. Still, he chose to keep writing. There had to be someone out there willing to look past appearances, to see that he was still a man with dreams and purpose. Maybe his world had grown small, but that didn't mean his heart had. Maybe he had. Something left to give, if only someone was willing to receive it. Each letter became a kind of silent rebellion, a declaration that he would not be erased by circumstance. They weren't just messages. They were markers that he still existed, still mattered, and still hoped. Even if the town had quietly decided he was finished, Marcus wasn't ready to accept that judgment. Not yet. The day Abigail arrived in Santa Olivia, Marcus didn't notice at first. He was in the shop, going through account ledgers, focused on a miscalculation in one of the inventories. But then he heard a voice, firm, direct, asking about lodging. Something in the tone made him glance up. There she was, tall, lean, in simple traveling clothes, holding an old suitcase that had clearly seen better days. She wasn't beautiful in the way that turned heads, but there was something striking about her. Maybe the way she carried herself, like someone who refused to fall apart no matter what life threw at her. Marcus watched her leave, then found himself staring at the door long after she had gone. He wasn't sure why, but her presence lingered. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. She looked like someone who had learned, as he had, to keep walking even when the road disappeared. And that struck something inside him that had been silent for a long time. The next day, when Marcus learned she had taken a room at Mrs. Dalva's boarding house, he found an excuse to pass. He claimed the shopkeeper had left a notebook there by mistake and offered to return it. When Abigail came out onto the porch, he introduced himself, nervous but composed. She nodded, offered a polite greeting, and spoke just enough to show she wasn't afraid of conversation, but not eager for it either. They talked briefly about the heat, the price of beans, and the difficulty of starting over. Neither mentioned the obvious, his crutches, her reasons for being in town. For Marcus, it was the first time in ages someone spoke to him without pity or avoidance. That night, lying in his hammock, he didn't think about pain or rejection. He thought about a woman holding her own weight without apology. And for the first time in months, he imagined something different. A story that might not end in loneliness after all. Abigail's arrival changed something. Not loudly, not instantly, but it stirred a part of Marcus that had gone dormant. She wasn't a letter. She wasn't an answer to a plea. She was real. And more than that, she was present. She didn't flinch around him, didn't pity him. And that, more than any romantic fantasy, gave him a reason to breathe differently. He didn't know her past, and she didn't ask about his, but they shared something unspoken. She, too, looked like someone who'd survived more than she wanted to say out loud. And in that shared silence, a possibility began to take root. Marcus didn't think of it as love. Not yet. It was something quieter. But no, less powerful. Hope, real, raw, and unexpected. The kind of hope that didn't come wrapped in paper or sealed in an envelope. It came with green eyes, a quiet voice, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he'd thought. It happened so quickly that Marcus didn't have time to think. One second, he was leaving the general store with a small parcel under his arm, and the next, a woman was collapsing right in front of him, her bag scattering its contents across the dirt road. Without hesitation, he dropped the parcel, and his crutches falling awkwardly to his knees beside her. People began to gather, murmuring and pointing, but Marcus tuned them out. He leaned over the woman, Abigail, he realized with a jolt, and checked her breathing, shallow but steady. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers. He shouted for someone to bring water, his voice stronger and louder than anyone had heard in months. As Mrs. Andrade rushed forward with a tin cup, Marcus gently raised Abigail's head and offered the drink to her parched lips. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, searching. "You're safe," he said, trying to sound calm despite the thudding in his chest. She looked at him, and for a brief second it wasn't just recognition, it was relief. She noticed his crutches lying nearby, her brow furrowed in concern. "You hurt yourself helping me?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I've had worse days." It wasn't meant to be heroic, just honest. They sat her up carefully, Marcus using his shoulder to stabilize her, pretending he didn't feel the familiar flare of pain in his leg. Abigail leaned against him, dazed but regaining strength. Someone gathered her belongings, and soon a wooden chair was fetched so she could rest. As the commotion subsided, Marcus stayed nearby, watching her with quiet attention. When she spoke again, her voice was low but steady. "I came here to meet someone, a man who placed a mail-order bride advertisement." Her eyes dropped. "When I arrived at his ranch, I learned he'd married another woman a week ago. No explanation, no apology, just gone." Marcus didn't speak immediately. He knew better than to fill silences that weren't meant to be broken. Instead, he waited, giving her space to say what she needed. "I have nowhere to go," she added simply. There was no trace of drama or pleading in her tone. It was a fact, a hard one, and Marcus, who knew all too well what it felt like to be discarded and invisible, felt something shift inside him. This wasn't pity, it was recognition. He had lived that silence, that rejection. Now he saw it in someone else's eyes. The town, as it always, hovered in the periphery, offering glances but not action. Marcus ignored them. "You don't have to figure it all out today," he said gently. "There's a boarding house down the road. Mrs. Dalva runs it. It's modest, but safe." Abigail looked at him, skepticism and exhaustion battling on her face. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He met her gaze evenly. "Because someone once helped me when I had no reason to expect it. That's enough, isn't it?" She didn't answer right away, but she didn't argue either. That was the first sign. As he helped her stand and recover her balance, Marcus realized something startling. He didn't feel like a burden in that moment. Not broken, not weak, just useful. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, not for appearance, but for real support. Together they walked the short distance toward the boarding house, and with every step Marcus felt himself walking out of the isolation he had wrapped around himself like armor. It was thin and unfamiliar, this connection, but it was real. That alone made it different from anything he'd experienced since the mind collapse that changed his life. Later that afternoon, after she'd rested and taken a proper meal, Abigail found him outside the shop where he'd returned to finish the errands he had abandoned. She approached him with hesitation, but also purpose. "You were kind today," she said simply. "Most people aren't." Marcus nodded, unsure what to say to that. "You didn't deserve what happened," he finally replied. "And I know what it feels like when people stop seeing you as a person and only see the things they don't want to understand." That made her pause. "How long has it been since your accident?" He blinked. 3 years. Almost to the day. She nodded slowly, and in a gesture that surprised them both, she sat down on the bench beside him. "I lost my first husband to fever. The second one died in an accident on his farm. I didn't expect to marry for love again, but I did expect not to be lied to." Marcus glanced at her, not out of politeness but curiosity. "And yet you came. Anyway?" "Because I didn't want to grow old alone," she said. "But maybe being alone is better than being humiliated." Her honesty was blunt, but it didn't feel cruel. Marcus didn't try to offer her comfort she hadn't asked for. What he offered instead was presence. He listened, not as a man eager to solve her problems, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. They talked for nearly an hour, about the strangeness of trusting strangers, about fear disguised as practicality, about how loss teaches you to stop expecting kindness. When Abigail stood up to return to the boarding house, she turned to him and said, "Thank you for not pretending today." It wasn't the kind of gratitude people gave for favors. It was deeper. Recognition again. The rare kind. Marcus nodded. "If you need anything, just ask." She studied him carefully. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I don't think you came here just to be disappointed," he said. "And because you deserve more than that." Her expression softened, and she gave a single nod before turning and walking away. It was a small moment, but for Marcus, it meant more than any letter he had ever written. A woman had looked at him and not turned away. That evening, as Marcus sat at his kitchen table, writing nothing for the first time in weeks, he realized he didn't feel the urge to draft another letter. There was no advertisement calling to him from a faraway newspaper, no imagined woman waiting on the other end. There was just Abigail, a real person in the same town who had seen him and let herself be seen in return. He thought of the way her hand had steadied on his arm, how her voice had steadied when she told the truth, and how neither of them had flinched from their scars. Maybe that's what made the difference. Not the letters or the hope they carried, but this. One person helping another up from the dust without asking for anything in return. It wasn't a love story, not yet, but it was something more important at that moment, mutual recognition. And as Marcus blew out the candle and let the silence settle over his small cabin, He realized he wasn't thinking about rejection anymore. He was thinking about a woman named Abigail, who had fallen in front of him and gotten back up, and how, in doing so, she had helped him stand again too. Over the next several days, Abigail and Marcus began walking together through the town, not out of obligation or romantic pursuit, but because it felt easier to talk when their feet were moving. It started simply enough: a stroll to the baker, a short walk past the chapel, a shared route toward the edge of the river where children sometimes played. There was no pretense between them, no forced conversation. They didn't try to impress each other. They just spoke. Marcus told her about the mine collapse, how the pain wasn't just physical, but lived in the way people looked through him now, as if he were half a man. Abigail listened without pity, and when she eventually responded, it was with a calm honesty that mirrored his. She told him how her first husband had died young, how her second had been practical but distant, how grief had trained her to rely on herself, and how trust wasn't something she gave freely anymore. Each day they exchanged more, peeling back layers of solitude like bark from an old tree. They were still strangers in many ways, but they were learning how to speak each other's language, the language of endurance, of quiet resilience. What set their conversations apart was that neither sought to fix the other. Marcus didn't try to reassure her with empty promises, and Abigail didn't pretend his limp didn't exist. When she asked him whether the pain ever truly went away, he surprised himself by answering, "No, but it stops being the only thing you notice." In return, she admitted how much she hated the sound of good intentions, how they often came from people who vanished the moment she became inconvenient. They laughed sometimes, dry and brief, but the kind of laughter that made room for breathing. One morning, as they sat near the edge of town watching a small herd of sheep being guided down the path, Marcus confessed he hadn't written any more letters since meeting her. "I used to think I was chasing hope through the mail," he said, "but maybe I was just trying to remind myself I wasn't invisible." Abigail didn't speak right away. She looked at him, really looked, and said, "You're not invisible, Marcus, not to me." And it was in that quiet moment, devoid of dramatics or declarations, that something began to settle between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust. They both knew what it meant to survive, not just physically but emotionally. Abigail shared stories of waking up alone, of meals eaten in silence, of pretending to be strong for the sake of appearances. Marcus admitted how deeply the rejection letters had cut him, not for their words, but for what they represented. The world's reluctance to believe someone like him could still offer something of value. They didn't wallow in self-pity, but they didn't pretend their scars didn't shape them either. Vulnerability, for once, wasn't weakness. It was invitation. One afternoon, as they lingered by the old schoolhouse, Abigail leaned on the fence and asked, "Do you think people like us are meant to be alone?" Marcus shook his head. "I think people like us just have to build something different, because what everyone else calls normal never fit us to begin with." That answer stayed with her. That night, she thought about it as she lay awake in her narrow boarding housebed, wondering what it would be like to build a life with someone who didn't expect her to be anything other than what she already was: a partner, an equal, someone who'd stand beside her, not in front or behind. The next day, Abigail invited Marcus to sit with her at the steps of the boarding house. The conversation was unremarkable at first: weather, errands, the rising cost of flour, but eventually she turned to him and said, "I've been thinking about something and I want to say it plainly." He nodded, his posture tense, uncertain. She didn't hesitate. "Marriage has never meant safety. To me, it's meant obligation, roles, expectations I never asked for. But with you, I don't feel like I have to perform. I don't have to be softer than I am, or quieter, or more grateful than I feel. So here's what I'm offering. Not a romance, not some fantasy, but a partnership, practical, honest, built on shared ground." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Her words weren't poetic, but they were precise. He could see the courage it took to say them, and it echoed something inside him that had gone long unspoken. Finally, he said, "That's the first proposal I've ever received that didn't make me feel like I had to apologize for who I am." She smiled faintly. That's because I'm not asking you to change. I'm just asking if you're willing to build something with me, from where we both actually stand. They spent the rest of that conversation mapping out their expectations, not just emotional ones, but practical ones too. They discussed chores, finances, what privacy would look like, and whether either of them even wanted children. There was no pretense of romance, no illusion that affection would bloom overnight, but there was respect, a deep one, and something that resembled peace. Marcus proposed that they give themselves a trial period, 2 weeks of regular visits, shared tasks, and open conversations. If by the end of it, they both still wanted the arrangement, they'd speak to the town's pastor. Abigail agreed immediately. 2 weeks is enough to know if someone listens or pretends, and I've had enough pretending. When they parted that evening, neither looked over their shoulder. There was no uncertainty between them, only clarity. It wasn't the kind of beginning most people dreamt of. But then again, Marcus and Abigail weren't most people. They were people who had already lived through the worst and come out scarred but standing. Now, for the first time, they were choosing something not out of desperation, but out of shared truth. And so, their agreement was made, not sealed with kisses or rings, but with a firm handshake and level eyes. A different kind of proposal, born not from longing but from lived experience. They weren't trying to fix each other or fill empty spaces with illusion. Instead, they were building something sturdy, practical, and intentional. One conversation, one shared task, one honest moment at a time. As Marcus walked home that night, leaning on his crutch but walking lighter than he had in years, he didn't imagine a wedding or a white dress. He imagined a life where silence didn't mean loneliness, and companionship didn't require pretending. Abigail, back in her small rented room, didn't dream of passion or grand gestures. She dreamed of being seen, and of seeing someone in return. And in that shared vision, something new began. Not love as the world expected it, but something better. A partnership that both of them had long believed they'd never deserve. A life built not from what was missing, but from what remained. The knock on the cabin door came just after dawn, sharp and uneven, followed by the frantic neigh of a horse. Abigail was still tying her shawl when she opened it and gasped. A man, mud-smeared, bloodied, barely upright, collapsed onto their porch. Marcus dropped his cane and rushed to help, and as Abigail knelt to roll him over, recognition washed over her face like a flood. "It's Daniel," she said, her voice unsteady. Marcus blinked. "Daniel, your brother-in-law." She nodded, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. Henry's brother. He disappeared after the funeral. Together they carried the unconscious man inside and laid him on the small couch by the hearth. Abigail began tending his wounds with practiced hands, but Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw stayed tight. Something wasn't right. Daniel's injuries were bad but not fatal. Still, Abigail's unease wasn't rooted in the blood. It came from something deeper, something remembered. Marcus didn't press. He'd learned by now when to let silence speak. He kept the fire going, fetched water, and stayed close, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. Some ghosts didn't knock. They burst in, demanding attention before you even had time to brace yourself. When Daniel finally regained consciousness, his first words weren't of gratitude or confusion. They were accusation. "You remarried?" he asked, scanning the cabin, his gaze lingering on Marcus's crutch. "Already?" Abigail didn't answer. Didn't. Immediately. She handed him a cup of water and said, 8 months have passed since Henry died. I didn't owe him or you more than that." Marcus watched the exchange quietly. Daniel had a sharpness to him that didn't come from pain. His eyes were always moving, evaluating, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. Over the next few days, as he regained his strength, it became clear why Abigail had tensed at the sight of him. Daniel was charming, but there was something underneath, something predatory. He made subtle remarks about Marcus's leg, about Abigail's quick decision to remarry, about how much easier life could have been if she'd waited for someone more capable. Marcus bore it quietly, until he noticed how Abigail flinched, Not at the comments themselves, but at the familiarity of them. This was not the first time she'd heard such poison disguised as conversation. And Daniel knew it. That was his weapon. Manipulation. He knew exactly which wounds to press and how hard to make them reopen. Abigail tried to maintain civility, but her patience frayed quickly. On the third evening, Daniel brought it to the surface. "You remember, don't you?" he said, staring into the fire. "How Henry used to handle his stress, the yelling, the other things. I never said anything back then. Thought it wasn't my business." Abigail froze. Marcus looked between them, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. "But I see now," Daniel continued. "Maybe I should have stepped in. Maybe you wouldn't be so desperate for a husband now if things had been different." That was it, the moment that shifted everything. Abigail stood, her entire body rigid with rage, but her voice remained calm. "You saw him hit me. You saw the bruises, and you walked away. Don't pretend regret now." Daniel looked up, feigning innocence. "I had no power back then. You had enough power to ask him for money after he burned me with a cigarette," she snapped. Marcus felt a sickness rise in his throat. It was more than betrayal. It was the casualness of it all. Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't need to. His silence was admission. And suddenly, Marcus understood the full weight of the man lying on their couch. Not just a wounded body, but a dangerous past. The next morning, Daniel made his move. "I need money," he said bluntly over breakfast. "Trouble followed me here. I owe men who don't forgive. Debts. California's the only place I can disappear. But I'll need at least 200 to make the journey." Marcus didn't respond. Abigail set her spoon down carefully. "We don't have that kind of money." "You do," Daniel said, eyes narrowing. "This place, the bookkeeping job, the land, it's worth something." "So is peace," Marcus said quietly. "And we're not about to trade it for your second chance at running." Daniel smirked. "Henry would have helped me." Abigail stood abruptly. "Henry is dead. And if he were here, he'd probably be the reason you're in this mess." Daniel's face twisted, but Abigail didn't stop. "Don't use his name to guilt me. You watched me suffer under him, and now you're here asking me to risk everything for you?" "No." She turned to Marcus. "We need to make it clear. This home is not for sale, not for guilt, not for family." Marcus nodded, and the strength in his eye. Agreement wasn't loud, but it was absolute. That unity was what made Daniel realize he couldn't divide them. So he pivoted to threats. "You'll regret this," Daniel said as he packed his things. "When they come looking for me, they'll look here first. They'll come for what I owe." Abigail didn't flinch. "Let them come. I'd rather face men with guns than let you stay here poisoning the air." She walked him to the door, and Marcus followed without needing to be asked. Outside, Daniel paused at his horse and looked at her one last time. "You used to dream about more than this. You settled." Abigail held his gaze steady and calm. "No, I chose. There's a difference." With that, he rode off, leaving dust in his wake. But not damage. Not this time. Abigail closed the door with finality. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Marcus wanted to ask if she was all right, but the words didn't come. She answered anyway. "That man is part of my past, but he won't define my future. Not here, not with you." Marcus reached for her hand. He tried to shake this house apart, and all he did was make it stronger. Abigail didn't reply, but her fingers tightened around his. And in that, they both knew something had changed. Not just in how they saw Daniel, but in how they saw each other. Expelling Daniel hadn't just been a decision. It had been a declaration. Abigail had faced down the worst parts of her past and chosen to protect the life she was trying to build. Not just for herself, but for both of them. And Marcus, watching her stand tall against that history, felt his own sense of worth deepen. She wasn't with him because she had no other option. She was with him because she believed in what they were building together. That evening, as they sat together in silence, the door finally shut on everything Daniel had tried to bring back into their lives. Shame, fear, powerlessness. Abigail didn't speak of him again, and Marcus didn't ask. They both knew the chapter had closed. What remained was trust, earned, tested, and reaffirmed. For the first time since they'd made their arrangement, They both saw it not just as an agreement, but as something unshakable. And as the firelight flickered between them, they understood. A home wasn't built by avoiding storms. It was built by surviving them. Together. The snowstorm came without warning. One morning the sky was pale but calm. By afternoon the wind had turned vicious, howling through the cracks in their modest cabin like a living thing. Marcus and Abigail hadn't expected it to hit so fast or with such intensity. Within hours, drifts of snow blocked the door, and the world outside vanished in a blur of white. Inside, the temperature dropped rapidly, and their stockpile of firewood began to dwindle. Worse still, the pantry was nearly bare. Just a few strips of dried meat, half a bag of flour, and a couple of withered root vegetables. Abigail rationed their meals carefully, stretching scraps into thin broths. But Marcus could see it in her face. Worry gnawed at her. His leg throbbed constantly, aching in the cold in a way that made sleep impossible. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. He couldn't afford to be the weak one now. What scared him more than the pain was the helplessness. The thought of Abigail starving beside him, while he lay useless under a blanket. That fear gripped him more tightly than the cold. Something had to change. They needed a plan before the storm outlasted their strength. It was Marcus who remembered. The old trading post, half a mile east, tucked into the side of a hill where the wind couldn't touch it as fiercely. He had helped survey the land years ago and knew the post had been stocked seasonally with emergency supplies for traveling merchants and couriers. It's a risk, he admitted, but it might be our only chance. Abigail didn't hesitate. Then we go. He began sketching the path with trembling fingers, explaining how they could follow the fence line from the Peterson property. It would guide them straight there, even in low visibility. We'll need to build something, he said. I can't walk that far in this snow. With Abigail's help, they took apart the dining table and turned it into a makeshift sled. Marcus would lie on it, bundled and strapped, and Abigail would pull. The irony wasn't lost on him. His body had become dead weight, and she would be the one carrying him to safety. He hated the thought of it, but when he voiced it, Abigail shut him down. You led us to the only solution we have, she said. Don't pretend that's not strength. That sentence stayed with him as they prepared. She didn't see weakness. She saw value. And that changed everything. The journey. Was brutal. The cold bit at their faces. The wind clawed at their coats, and the snow reached up to Abigail's thighs as she pulled the sled inch by inch across the field. Marcus gritted his teeth against the guilt, against the pain in his leg, against the helplessness of watching someone he loved. Labor for both their lives. He used a long stick to prod at the ground, making sure they remained near the buried fence line. Every time Abigail stumbled, he wanted to scream, but she always stood again, always kept moving. He had never witnessed such determination up close. She wasn't just pulling weight, she was pulling hope. After what felt like hours, Marcus spotted the familiar rise in the land. There, he said, pointing. The hill, it's there. Abigail didn't speak. She just nodded once, tightened her grip on the rope, and pressed forward. When they finally reached the post, Marcus helped her unfasten the sled despite the pain slicing through his hip. Inside, they found it. Firewood, canned goods, even a few blankets sealed in barrels. Enough to last. Abigail collapsed onto the floor, soaked and exhausted, and Marcus dragged himself beside her. He took her frozen hand in his and whispered, You saved me. Her eyes closed, and she replied, We saved each other. That night they huddled together under heavy wool blankets, the fire crackling for the first time in days. Marcus had a fever. His body trembled from the strain, and Abigail pressed a damp cloth to his head as he drifted in and out of sleep. She listened to his rambling, snippets about the survey crew, about the mine, about things he never spoke of when he was fully aware, and she cared for him without hesitation. There was no resentment in her actions, no weariness that turned to blame, only quiet, resolve. And in those hours, Marcus understood something fundamental. He had not been rescued. He had been partnered. She wasn't acting out of obligation. She was choosing, actively and fiercely, to hold the line for both of them. And in that, He finally let go of the belief that strength meant walking unaided. It meant knowing when to lead and when to let yourself be carried. Abigail had taught him that with every step she'd taken through the snow, and now, as he rested against her shoulder, he began to believe in a version of himself that didn't need fixing, just support and trust. 3 days passed before the storm eased enough to make the return journey possible. Marcus was stronger by then, able to limp short distances, and together they packed what they could onto the same sled. This time, he walked beside it, leaning on Abigail, refusing to be carried a second time. When they finally arrived at their cabin, it looked smaller, more fragile than before, but it was still standing. The relief was almost overwhelming. That night, after rest and food, they sat at the edge of their shared bed, the silence between them heavier than usual, not with fear, but with understanding. "You're not just my wife," Marcus said, voice low. "You're the reason I'm still here." Abigail turned to him, her hand resting over his. "And you're the reason I kept going. You gave us a direction when I couldn't see one." They didn't kiss or cry or fall into each other's arms. That wasn't who they were. But in the quiet that followed, they knew something had shifted. They were no longer testing this life together. They had chosen it, survived for it, and would now protect it, no matter what came next. That was the beginning of something stronger than survival. It was the start of permanence. By the next morning, the cabin was warm again, and their food stocks replenished. The ordeal had left marks, bruises, aches, and a weariness that couldn't be soothed in a single night. But something else lingered too. Something better. A certainty neither had spoken aloud until now, when Marcus sat down at the table and Abigail placed a hot cup of broth in front of him. They didn't need to exchange words. It was in the way he reached for her hand, and the way she didn't pull away. The winter storm had tested them more than either had expected. It had forced them into vulnerability, into pain, into fear. But it had also revealed the foundation they'd built, one of choice, effort, and equal sacrifice. They had faced death not as strangers, nor as desperate individuals clinging to survival, but as something more, true partners. And as they sat together in the fragile peace that followed the storm, they knew this wasn't just a temporary agreement anymore. This was a life they were shaping together, forged not in comfort, but in fire and snow. Their hands met in silent understanding, and with that, the bond was sealed. The idea of surgery came not from Marcus himself, but from Dr. Fleming during one of his routine visits. After inspecting Marcus's leg and asking a few pointed questions, the doctor sat back in his chair and said, "There's a specialist in the capital, Dr. Harrington. He's been working with cases like yours. If you're willing to undergo surgery, there's a chance he could improve your mobility, maybe even reduce the pain for good." The words landed like a stone in Marcus's chest. Improve, reduce, chance. It all sounded too hopeful, too risky. For months now, he and Abigail had worked to build something steady, reliable routines, shared labor, quiet evenings. They had built a life, and now he was being asked to risk all of it for a vague possibility. As the doctor listed the procedures and risks, Marcus nodded, said little, and let the noise settle into the background. What if the surgery failed? What if it left him worse than before? He knew how to manage what he had now, his limp, the pain, the limitations. He'd already adapted. The unknown, however, was a shadow he wasn't sure he could step into, not without losing everything they'd fought so hard to make their own. Abigail listened quietly that evening as Marcus explained everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't minimize the fear in his voice. When he finished, she simply said, "Do you want to do it?" He hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've come to terms with my life as it is. I've made peace with the pain. I've built something good with you, and I'm afraid that chasing something better could destroy it." Abigail reached for his hand, her grip steady. "Peace isn't the same as comfort, Marcus. You've adapted, yes. You've endured. But if there's a chance that you could wake up one day without pain, without struggle, don't you owe it to yourself to try?" Marcus didn't respond right away. She wasn't pushing him, But she wasn't letting him shrink back either. That was who she was. Someone who had learned the difference between surviving and living. "I'm scared," he whispered. Abigail nodded. "Me, too? But that's never stopped us before." And with those simple words, the decision no longer felt like his alone. It became something shared. Like everything else between them, it would be faced together. They began making preparations. Marcus wrote to the clinic, filled out forms, and scheduled a consultation with the specialist. Abigail arranged for the neighbor to care for their chickens and oversee the property during their absence. Every detail was handled with care, but beneath the practical tasks ran a current of tension. Marcus struggled with guilt. Guilt for the money it would cost, for the burden he might become during recovery, for the fear that he'd let Abigail down if things went wrong. One night while packing, he broke down. "What if I fail?" he asked. "What if I can't recover? What if I'm nothing but a shell of the man you agreed to marry?" Abigail didn't try to soothe him with empty promises. Instead, she said, "Then we'll adjust. Again, like we always have. I didn't marry you because of how you walk, Marcus. I married you because you never stopped moving forward, even when it hurt. That's what I believe in. That's what I'm standing beside." In her voice was the same unwavering strength that had pulled him through snowdrifts and silence, and now, through fear. He kissed her forehead and held her longer than he had in weeks. The fear didn't leave, but it lessened. The hospital was overwhelming at first. Clean, organized, filled with strangers and clinical smells. It felt miles away from the life they had carved out together. Marcus met Dr. Harrington, who examined his leg thoroughly and confirmed that while the surgery couldn't restore everything, it could make daily life significantly easier. "But it will hurt," the doctor warned, "and recovery will take months. You'll have to relearn how to walk, and that takes patience." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. That night, as they lay in the narrow hospital bed they'd been given to share, Abigail whispered, "I believe in the version of you that comes out the other side of this." Marcus smiled faintly in the dark. "Even if I'm slower? Even if I don't come back stronger?" She turned to face him. "Especially then, because we don't measure strength the way others do, remember?" He nodded. Their love had never been built on grand gestures or flawless bodies. It had been built on long walks through uncertainty, hands held in silence, shared fear, and mutual survival. This surgery, this risk, was simply the next chapter, and they were ready to face it as they had faced everything else. Side by side. On the morning of the operation, Marcus was terrified, but Abigail stood with him until the very last moment before he was wheeled away, her hand never leaving his. As the doors closed, she whispered, "You're not doing this alone." And he carried that with him into the unknown. The hours crawled, but when he awoke, groggy and aching, she was there. Her eyes tired, but her grip strong. "You made it," she said. "The hard part's done." He didn't respond at first, just looked at her, then at his bandaged leg. "Still here?" he rasped. "Always," she replied. The days that followed were hard. Pain returned in new ways, unfamiliar and sharp. But Marcus could already tell. Something had shifted. The weight in his knee was different. The alignment, the way his foot rested. It wasn't perfect, but it was promising. Abigail helped him through each step of recovery, sometimes literally, and Marcus in turn offered what he could: humor, determination, and the kind of gratitude that can only come from being carried and still feeling strong. They didn't talk about the future in big declarations, but with each step Marcus took, the message was clear. They were still building something worth holding on to. By the time they returned home months later, the trees had changed and the air had warmed. Their cabin waited for them, unmoved but never the same. Marcus walked through the doorway on his own with only a cane now, and Abigail smiled at the sight. "Told you we'd get here," she said. He looked around, then back at her. "Not without you." And for the first time, the fear that had followed him for years, the fear of being less, of being abandoned, of not being enough, finally loosened its grip. In its place stood something solid, not confidence in his body, but in the bond they'd created. It was love, yes, but not the fleeting kind. It was love forged in fire, quiet, resilient, deeply rooted in respect and shared resilience. They stood together in the center of the room, sunlight coming through the window, and neither said a word. They didn't need to. Hope and courage were no longer things they searched for. They were things they had built. And, whatever came next, they would face it not as broken people trying to be whole, but as partners who had already found wholeness in each other. If you enjoyed this chapter and want to follow more stories of grit, resilience, and unexpected love on the frontier, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. New chapters drop weekly, right here on Souls of the Old West, where every heart has a history and every soul has a story worth telling.